They told the world she was broken. They called her a defect, an omega with no wolf and no future. When the High Council of the Sterling Pack exiled Sable Halloway, they thought she would die in the snow. They thought she would vanish into the wilderness like every other rejected wolf before her, swallowed by the cold, erased from memory. They were wrong, because while the alphas were busy fighting over territory and crowns, Sable was not dying. She was building. Every rejected pup, every twisted shifter, every child the packs tried to drown in the river or leave on the mountainside to freeze. They did not die. They found her. They ran to her. And now the Alpha King himself is knocking on her door, searching for a stolen heir. But he is about to discover that the woman he threw away has raised an army of the broken. And she is holding the one secret that could burn his entire kingdom to the ground. This is the story of the Mother of the Lost. 4 years earlier, the Great Hall of Sterling Palace smelled of cedar smoke and judgment. Sable remembered everything about that night. The way the torchlight cast long shadows across the marble floor. The way the council members sat in their carved wooden thrones like gods deciding the fate of insects. The way her knees ached against the cold stone because they had made her kneel for over an hour before anyone spoke. She was 22 years old. Her hair hung in careful braids she had spent the morning weaving, as though looking presentable might somehow change the outcome. Her hands were clasped in her lap, trembling, but she kept her spine straight. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her collapse. Not yet. High Elder Creighton spoke first. He was an old man with a voice like dry paper tearing. He read the decree without emotion, as though he were announcing the weather. Sable Halloway, daughter of the late Marcus and Edith Halloway, you have been tested by the sacred trials and found to be without a wolf spirit. You carry no inner beast. You cannot shift. By the ancient laws governing bloodline purity, you are hereby declared defective and sentenced to exile from the Sterling Pack, effective immediately. The word landed like a stone dropped into still water. Defective. It rippled outward through the silent hall, touching every face, every pair of eyes that refused to meet hers. Sable lifted her gaze to the throne at the center of the dais. Cassian Voss Sterling sat there, the Alpha King. He was 30 then, broad-shouldered and sharp-jawed, with dark hair and eyes the color of tempered steel. He held a quill in his right hand. The exile document lay before him on a silver tray. He did not look at her. He signed his name in one fluid stroke, set the quill down, and nodded once to the guards. That was it. No hesitation, no glance. She was not worth the effort of eye contact, but it was not the king's signature that broke her. A chair scraped against stone. A man stood up from the second row, tall, golden-haired, with a jaw that could have been carved from granite. Theron, her fiancé, the man who, exactly 1 year ago, had knelt under a harvest moon and slid a ring onto her finger and whispered, "Whatever you are, Sable, I will love you. That is my promise." He cleared his throat. His voice carried beautifully in the acoustics of the great hall. "I wish to make a public statement. I, Theron of the Birchwood line, formally dissolve my engagement to Sable Halloway. I cannot bind myself to a defective Omega. My bloodline deserves better." He sat down. He did not look at her either. Sable felt something crack inside her chest. Not her heart. Something deeper. The place where trust lives. The place where you keep the belief that someone, somewhere, will choose you. 2 guards lifted her by the arms. They walked her down the center aisle, past hundreds of pack members who had known her since childhood. Not one of them spoke. Not one of them reached out. Except a small girl, maybe 6 years old, broke free from her mother's grip and ran into the aisle. She grabbed Sable's hand. Her eyes were wide, her tiny fingers warm. "Miss Sable, where are you going?" Sable looked down at the child. She tried to smile. "Somewhere far away, sweetheart." The girl's mother yanked her back, hissing apologies to the guards. Sable watched the child's face disappear into the crowd. She memorized it. The round cheeks, the dark eyes full of confusion and kindness. Then the palace doors closed behind her, and the snow swallowed her whole. 4 years later, the bitter wind of the Montana wilderness did not care about bloodlines. It did not care if you were an alpha or an omega. It just wanted to freeze the marrow in your bones. Sable Halloway wiped her forehead with the back of a gloved hand, smearing dirt across her pale skin. She was 26 now, though the hard lines around her eyes made her look older. Her hair, once kept in those intricate braids, was chopped short and practical. Her hands were calloused. Her shoulders were broad from years of chopping wood and hauling water and carrying children who were too sick or too broken to walk. She adjusted the heavy post of the cedar fence she was repairing. It was not built to keep things out. It was built to keep the little ones from wandering into the forest and getting lost. She had learned that lesson the hard way during her first winter, when a 7-year-old boy with no sense of direction and half a shifted leg had wandered 2 miles into a snowstorm before Sable found him curled against a pine tree, blue-lipped and barely breathing. The sanctuary sat deep in the Bitterroot National Forest, on a plot of land technically owned by a shell corporation Sable had set up using her dead grandmother's inheritance. It was off every grid that mattered. No pack maps, no council registries, just 40 acres of frozen earth, a dilapidated farmhouse, a leaning barn with a rusted school bus inside, and 18 children who had nowhere else to go. "Sable! Sable! He is shifting again!" The scream came from the porch. It was Nettie, a 14-year-old girl with a jagged scar running from her left ear all the way down to her collarbone. A parting gift from the alpha of the Blue Ridge pack, who had sliced her open for talking back and then tossed her out in the snow for being too disobedient to keep. Nettie had crawled for 3 days before Sable found her near the highway, delirious and half dead. Sable dropped her hammer and sprinted. Her boots slammed against the frozen mud, her breath pluming white in the December air. She did not have a wolf spirit. That was the whole reason the Sterling pack had rejected her, but she ran with a desperate speed that seemed to defy her biology, fueled by something stronger than any inner beast. She burst through the front door of the cabin. The smell hit her instantly. Burning wood, damp wool, and the sharp metallic tang of terror. In the center of the living room, huddled under a scratched oak table, was a 6-year-old boy named Bridger. He was shaking so violently that his bones were audible, clicking and grinding like dice in a cup. "Bridger," Sable said. Her voice dropped to a low, steady hum, the way you might speak to a wild animal caught in a trap. "Look at me." The boy looked up. His eyes were bleeding from their natural brown to a feral, glowing yellow. His jaw was unhinging, the bones snapping out of alignment with a sound like green wood breaking. This was not a normal shift. This was a reject shift, the kind that happened to children whose wolf spirits were damaged or incomplete, the kind that killed half the kids who went through it, the kind that was so painful and so ugly that most packs simply euthanize these children at birth to spare themselves the inconvenience. "It hurts, Sable!" Bridger screamed, his voice distorting into something between a boy's cry and a growl. "Make it stop! Please make it stop!" Sable did not flinch. She got down on her hands and knees and crawled under the table. Bridger's fingernails were lengthening into claws, and they tore at her flannel shirt as she pulled him into her chest. She wrapped her arms around his spasming body and held tight. "I have got you," she whispered, pressing her forehead against his damp hair. "I need you to listen to my heartbeat. Can you hear it? 1, 2, 1, 2. Just breathe with me." This was her gift, the thing the council had completely missed when they declared her defective. Sable Halloway could not shift. She had no wolf, but she was something far rarer and far more dangerous than any shifter. She was a grounder, a living sedative for out-of-control wolves. As she held the convulsing boy, a subtle, invisible energy pulsed from her skin. It was not magic in the fairy tale sense. It was biology. Her pheromones were heavy, tranquilizing, and absolute. They seeped into Bridger's bloodstream through skin contact and scent, overriding his haywire nervous system, forcing his wolf to stand down. Slowly, Bridger's bones snapped back into place. The yellow faded from his eyes. He collapsed against her chest, sobbing softly, his small body shaking with exhaustion. "I am sorry," he wept. "I am a monster." Sable pulled back and took his face in her hands. She wiped the blood from his mouth with her sleeve and looked him dead in the eyes. "You are not a monster. You are strong. You survived something that would have killed a grown alpha. That makes you better than every single person who ever threw you away." She crawled out from under the table, lifting the heavy boy into her arms. The living room was filled with 12 other pairs of eyes, children of various ages, watching from the shadows, from behind furniture, from the staircase. There was Josiah, 16, with a withered leg that dragged when he walked, his face calm but his hands gripping a crowbar. There was Corwin, 8, who had not spoken a single word since the day Sable found him. And there were the twins, Lunette and Vera, born with no scent at all, which in the werewolf world was considered an abomination. These were the garbage of the shifter world, the ones who were too broken, too wrong, too inconvenient to keep, and they were her family. "Nettie," Sable said, her voice shifting to command, "get a cold compress for Bridger. Josiah, check the perimeter. The storm is picking up." Josiah nodded, limping toward the window. Then he stopped. His entire body went rigid, like a deer catching a scent it knows means death. "Sable?" His whisper was barely audible. "There is a truck." The air in the room changed. Sable set Bridger down gently and walked to the window. She peered through the grime-streaked glass. Sitting at the edge of their clearing, idling next to the broken fence line, was a massive black SUV. It was not a civilian vehicle. It had tinted windows, armor plating visible along the doors, and on the front grille a distinct silver crest, a wolf rampant, the symbol of the Royal Guard of the Sterling Pack. Sable's heart stopped for exactly one beat. Then it restarted at double speed. She turned to the children. Panic was a luxury she could not afford. "Everyone to the cellar. Now. Quietly." "Sable?" Nettie's voice was thin with terror. "Go." The word left no room for argument. As the children scrambled toward the hidden trap door beneath the rug, Sable smoothed her hair and grabbed the shotgun leaning against the fireplace. It was loaded with rock salt, useless against a shifting alpha, but good enough for making a point. She stepped out onto the porch. The car door opened. A man stepped out. He was tall, wearing a tailored wool coat that probably cost more than Sable's entire property. His boots were polished leather, now sinking into the mud with a soft squelch. He had dark hair, silver threading through the temples, and eyes the color of tempered steel. Sable felt the air leave her lungs. It was not just a guard. It was Cassian Voss Sterling, the Alpha King. The man who had signed her exile papers 4 years ago without looking her in the eye. He looked older now, harder. There were new lines around his mouth and a tension in his jaw that had not been there before. He scanned the property with a soldier's precision, taking in the leaning barn, the cracked windows, the fence Sable had been repairing. Then his gaze found her. He took a deep breath, inhaling the mountain air. His brow creased. Something in her scent confused him. She smelled of pine and wood smoke, which was expected, but underneath that there was something else, something warm and heavy and almost sweet. It smelled like milk, like a nursery, like safety. "Hello, Sable," he said. His voice was deep, resonant, vibrating through the wooden planks of the porch like a low chord struck on a cello. "You are hard to find." Sable racked the shotgun. The sound cracked across the clearing like a promise. "I am not lost, Cassian. Get off my land." He held up his hands, palms open. "I am not here to hurt you. You already did that 4 years ago." She kept the gun level with his chest. "State your business and leave." 3 days ago, Cassian said, and his voice shifted. The diplomacy fell away. What was underneath was raw. "My brother's son, my nephew, the heir apparent to the Sterling line. He was taken from the Royal Nursery in Seattle. His scent trail ends 3 miles down that logging road." He pointed behind him. "I have reason to believe he is here." Sable's pulse hammered against her ribs. She had 18 children in her cellar. None of them were high-born heirs. They were the ones people threw away. But 2 days ago, she had found a boy wandering near the highway, half frozen, silent. He had no scent, which was why she assumed he was a null like Lunette and Vera. He was currently sleeping in the cellar, wrapped in a quilt Sable had stitched herself. She had not checked his shoulder. "I run a sanctuary for rejected children," Sable said, fighting to keep her voice level. "If a child is here, it is because he was abandoned." "He was not abandoned," Cassian said. "He was stolen." "Or maybe," Sable said slowly, "he ran." Cassian's eyes narrowed. "His name is Oren. He is 4 years old. He has a birthmark on his left shoulder shaped like a crescent moon." The name hit Sable like a fist to the stomach. She kept her face neutral, but her mind was racing. "Come inside," she said. "Just you." Cassian followed her into the cabin. She led him to the trap door and called down softly. One by one, the children emerged. Josiah first, gripping his crowbar, then Nettie, then the twins. Cassian watched them climb out, and something shifted behind his steel eyes. He looked at the ragged group of kids, some with visible scars, some with the wrong colored eyes, some missing limbs. Then the small boy climbed out last, sleepy, confused, clutching a stuffed rabbit Nettie had given him. Cassian dropped to his knees. The ruthlessness vanished from his face. "Oren," his voice broke on the name. "Oren, thank the goddess." He reached out to take the boy. "No!" Oren screamed, scrambling backward behind Josiah's legs. His small body was shaking. "Do not hurt me. Do not let him hurt me." Cassian froze. His hand hung in the air. "Oren, it is Uncle Cassian. I am taking you home to your father." "No," the boy shrieked so loudly the windows rattled. "Daddy hurt me. Daddy burned me." The silence that followed was absolute. Sable walked past the Alpha King. She placed herself between him and the children and knelt down in front of Oren. "Oren," she said gently, "can you show me your shoulder, sweetheart?" The boy sniffled, his eyes searching her face. He did not trust the king, but he trusted Sable. He pulled down the collar of his oversized shirt. There, on his left shoulder, was the crescent birthmark, but right next to it was a fresh, angry burn. It looked like a cigar burn, and there was another on his neck, and faint yellowing bruises on both arms, shaped like adult fingers. Sable stood up. She turned to Cassian. Her eyes burned with a fury that rivaled any alpha's. "He was not stolen." Her voice was low and shaking. He ran from your brother, from Harlan Sterling, the man you made Pac Beta, the man you trusted with the air." Cassian stared at the marks on his nephew's body. The color drained from his face. "That is impossible. Harlan is a healer. He would never." "Look at him," Sable shouted, and every child in the room flinched. She lowered her voice, but the anger did not diminish. "These children do not run to me because they want a vacation, Cassian. They run to me because their own parents, your noble pack members, treat them like garbage because they are not perfect." Cassian opened his mouth, closed it. He looked at Oren. He looked at the bruises. And for the first time since Sable had known him, the Alpha King had nothing to say. Then his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. His face went from pale to gray. "The Council Enforcers," he said quietly. "Elder Crichton's men. They have been tracking separately. They will be here in 20 minutes. Sable's blood turned to ice. The Council Enforcers. The Kill Squad. If they found a house full of unregistered defective children, they would not ask questions. Standard protocol for genetic cleansing was simple. Burn the structure, eliminate the evidence, file the report as a rogue incident. 18 children, 20 minutes. "You have to leave," Sable said. "Take Oren if you must, but get away from here before they arrive." Cassian looked at the shivering group of children. He looked at Nettie, whose hand had gone to the scar on her throat. He looked at Josiah, standing with his crowbar and his withered leg, ready to fight. He looked at the twins, who were holding each other so tightly their knuckles had gone white. And then he looked at Sable. He saw the fire in her eyes, the way she stood between the children and the world, arms spread, a human shield made of nothing but stubbornness and love. He made a decision. "I am not leaving," Cassian said. He walked to the window and locked the deadbolt. He unbuttoned his expensive wool coat, revealing the tactical holster beneath. He pulled a heavy silver handgun and checked the chamber. 20 wolves are coming up that hill, and they are not here to talk. Sable stared at him. "Why? Why would you stay?" Cassian met her eyes. For the first time in 4 years, he actually looked at her. "Because I owe you a debt I can never repay, and because no child should die for the crime of being born different." He turned to the window. "Get them back in the cellar. Seal it from the inside." "What are you going to do?" Cassian smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was a grim, terrifying expression that showed every one of his teeth. "I am the Alpha King," he said. "I am going to remind them why." The enforcers hit the cabin like a wave. 20 men in tactical gear, the silver insignia of the council on their chests. They came through the front door, the windows, the back entrance. Cassian met them in the living room. He fought in human form because the space was too confined for a full shift. He was a whirlwind of violence, using a broken chair leg as a baton, his movements precise and savage. 3 men dropped in the first 10 seconds, but they kept coming. 5 circled him, a brute named Durnan, whom Sable recognized from her old pack, lunged at Cassian's back with a silver blade, the blade that could kill even an alpha. "Cassian!" Sable screamed from the trapdoor. She should have stayed below. She knew that, but she could not sit in the dark and listen to him die for her children. She raised the shotgun and fired. The rock salt hit Durnan square in the face. He howled, dropping the knife, clutching his ruined eyes. Cassian spun. "I told you to stay down." "I do not take orders from you." Sable racked the slide. "Duck." She fired again, blasting a wolf climbing through the window, but the distraction cost them. A massive enforcer tackled Cassian into the wall. 2 others pinned his arms. A third, the squad leader, Galt, Crichton's right hand, leveled a pistol at Cassian's temple. "Hold him," Galt barked. He looked at Sable, then at Cassian, and a sneer crept across his scarred face. The king and the exile. What a touching reunion. He signaled his men. "Kill the king. Make it look like the rogue did it. Then burn the house with the defects inside." Sable felt a cold calm wash over her. The kind of calm that comes when you have run out of options and the only thing left is the truth. She dropped the shotgun. It clattered against the floor. "What are you doing?" Cassian roared, struggling against the men holding him. Sable closed her eyes. She reached deep inside herself, past the fear, past the adrenaline, past 4 years of exile and grief and cold and loneliness. She found the core of her biology. The thing the council called a defect. The thing that was not a defect at all. She focused on her heartbeat, slow, heavy, deep, and then she pushed. She had always kept her pheromones contained, just enough to soothe a crying child, just enough to calm a reject shift. Now she stopped holding back. She opened the floodgates and released a concentrated wave of pheromones so potent it was almost visible in the air, a thick, sweet, suffocating heaviness that rolled through the room like fog. "Sleep," her instinct commanded. "Submit. Calm. Surrender." The effect was instantaneous. The enforcer holding the gun at Cassian's head blinked. His hand wavered. His pupils blew wide. "What is that smell?" he slurred, his words thickening as though he were drunk. Galt staggered backward, clutching his skull. "Why am I... What is..." The wolves in the room, driven by high adrenaline aggression, were hit the hardest. Their biology crashed as the sedative pheromones forced their systems into a rapid shutdown. Knees buckled, guns dropped, eyes rolled. "Now, Cassian," Sable whispered. Cassian, whose alpha blood made him more resistant to the effects, did not waste the opening. He headbutted the man holding him with a sound like a cracking walnut, seized the fallen pistol, and fired 3 precise shots. Galt and 2 others dropped. The remaining men stumbled through the fog of Sable's scent, fighting the overwhelming biological command to lie down and sleep. Cassian moved through them like a scythe, dropping each one with brutal efficiency. In 10 seconds, the room was silent. Cassian stood in the center of the carnage, his chest heaving. Blood ran from a gash above his eye. He turned and looked at Sable. She was leaning against the door frame, pale, trembling, completely drained. Using her gift at full power had cost her physically. She looked like she might collapse, but his eyes were wide, not with anger, with something closer to awe. He could feel it even now. the heaviness in his limbs, the strange, almost narcotic pull to lie down at her feet and close his eyes. He shook his head hard, fighting it off. "What?" Cassian gasped, bracing against the wall. "Are you?" Sable looked at the unconscious enforcers scattered across her living room floor. Then she looked at the king. "I am the defect," she whispered. "I am the thing you threw away." And in that moment, Cassian understood. The council had not exiled Sable Halloway because she was weak. They had exiled her because they were terrified of what she was. An Omega who could command alphas to sleep. That was not a disability. That was the most dangerous power in the kingdom. "More will come," Cassian said, shaking the fog from his mind. "We have to go. Now." Sable nodded toward the barn. "There is a school bus. Old, but I reinforced it. Steel plates. Run flat tires." "A school bus?" Cassian wiped blood from his eye and almost laughed. Almost. The Alpha King fleeing in a school bus. "Would you prefer to stay and die?" "Get the children!" 5 minutes later, the rusted yellow bus roared to life in the barn. Sable loaded 18 children through the emergency door while Cassian hot-wired the ignition. Oren was the last one on, clutching his stuffed rabbit, his eyes huge and haunted. Cassian dropped into the driver's seat and slammed the bus into gear. The tires bit into the frozen mud, and the bus lurched forward, crashing through the barn doors and out into the snowstorm. In the rearview mirror, the farmhouse grew smaller, the only home these children had ever known. Sable sat in the passenger seat, a folding chair bolted to the floor, and watched it disappear. She did not cry. She had used up her tears 4 years ago on the steps of Sterling Palace in the snow. But beside her, gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles, the Alpha King was driving a school bus full of broken children into the wilderness. And for the first time in 4 years, Sable Halloway was not alone. The Interstate 90 corridor through Idaho was a death trap in December. A ribbon of black ice winding through mountains that did not care whether you lived or died. But Cassian did not take the highway. He took the old logging roads, the ones that were not on any GPS, the ones that Sable had memorized during 4 years of running supply missions in the dark. The bus groaned and shuddered as it bounced along the frozen ruts. The heater was broken. Frost crept across the inside of the windshield in feathered patterns. Cassian drove with both hands locked on the wheel, his jaw tight, his eyes scanning the tree line with the focus of a man who had spent years expecting an ambush. He had stripped off his ruined wool coat and was driving in a blood-stained white dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. His forearms were covered in scratches and shallow cuts that were already healing, the skin knitting together with the slow, visible precision of alpha regeneration. Sable watched the wounds close from the passenger seat. She had never seen a wolf heal this fast before. It was unsettling and mesmerizing at the same time, like watching time move in the wrong direction. In the back of the bus, the children were eerily quiet. Some had fallen asleep, their small bodies curled into the cracked vinyl seats, exhaustion finally winning the war against fear. Others stared out the windows at the passing darkness with the hollow, 1,000-yard gaze of children who had learned very young that safety was always temporary. Oren was sitting next to Bridger in the 3rd row. The 4-year-old had his head on the older boy's shoulder, and Bridger had wrapped one arm around him without being asked. They were sharing a bag of pretzels that Nettie had grabbed from the kitchen during the evacuation. Neither of them spoke. They did not need to. They had a shared language that went deeper than words. The language of children who knew what it felt like to be hurt by the people who were supposed to protect them. Sable turned back to the windshield. The silence between her and Cassian was enormous. It filled the cab like something physical, like smoke, like water rising slowly around their ankles. She could smell him. Even over the diesel fumes and the rust and the lingering copper of dried blood, she could smell him. Pine resin, cold stone, and something underneath that she could not name. Something electric and dark, like the air before a thunderstorm. She hated that she noticed. "You handle that thing well," Sable said, breaking the silence. She nodded at the steering wheel. For a king who usually rides in armored limousines. "I was a soldier before I was a king, Sable." His voice was tight, controlled. "3 tours on the border disputes. I know how to drive a bus." He paused. His hands adjusted on the wheel. "You never told the council." "Told them what?" "About your gift. The pheromones." He glanced at her. The dashboard lights cast a green glow across his sharp features, deepening the shadows under his cheekbones. "If they had known you were a grounder of that magnitude, they would not have exiled you. They would have made you a high priestess or a weapon." Sable let out a sound that was almost a laugh. "Almost. That is exactly why I did not tell them. I did not want to be a broodmare for unstable alphas. I did not want to be a government tranquilizer gun. I just wanted to live." "So you let us think you were broken." "I am broken, Cassian, according to your laws." She turned in her seat to face him. Her knee brushed against the center console. She pulled it back quickly. "Every child on this bus is broken according to your laws. That is the problem." Cassian said nothing. His jaw worked as though he were chewing on a response he could not swallow. "Tell me about them," he said finally. His voice had changed. The command was gone. What replaced it was quieter, more careful. "The children. How did they end up with you?" Sable studied him for a long moment, trying to decide if the question was genuine or strategic. She decided it did not matter. The truth was the truth, regardless of who was listening. "Nettie was 12 when the alpha of the Blue Ridge Pack cut her throat," Sable said. Her voice was flat, factual. She had learned a long time ago that telling these stories with emotion made people uncomfortable, and uncomfortable people stopped listening. He sliced her open from her ear to her collarbone with a hunting knife in front of the entire pack. Her crime was talking back during a training exercise. He left her in the snow. She crawled for 3 days before I found her near the highway. Cassian's hands tightened on the wheel. The leather groaned. Josiah was born with his leg. His pack tested him at age 6 and decided he was unfit. They left him at a bus station in Bozeman with a note pinned to his jacket that said, "Return to sender." He was 6 years old, Cassian. The note was pinned through his skin. The bus hit a rut. Cassian corrected the wheel, but his breathing had changed. It was deeper, slower, the kind of deliberate breathing a man does when he is trying very hard not to lose control. Lunette and Vara were born without scent. The council classified them as abominations. Their pack voted to drown them in the river on the night of the spring equinox. A tradition, apparently. I intercepted the ceremony and took them. They were 11 months old. Silence. Corwin has not spoken since I found him. I do not know his full story. I know he was 7 when he appeared at my fence line at 3 in the morning, barefoot in the snow, wearing a hospital gown. There were surgical staples in his scalp. I never found out which facility he came from. Cassian exhaled through his nose, a long, controlled breath that fogged the windshield. "I did not know," he said. The words sounded insufficient even as they left his mouth. He knew it. Sable knew it. "You did not look," Sable corrected. She was not cruel about it. She was not kind about it either. She simply stated it the way she stated the temperature or the distance to the next turn. "You sat on your throne and signed papers and trusted your counsel to handle the details. And the details were children, Cassian. The details were Nettie's throat and Josiah's leg, and babies being drowned in rivers." He did not argue. He did not defend himself. He just drove, his knuckles white, the muscle in his jaw jumping like a pulse. Sable respected that more than any apology he could have offered. They stopped once during the night, pulling the bus off the logging road into a dense cluster of Douglas firs where the canopy was thick enough to hide them from aerial surveillance. The engine ticked as it cooled. The temperature inside the bus dropped rapidly. Sable moved through the rows, checking on each child. She tucked a blanket tighter around the twins. She felt Corwin's forehead for fever. She adjusted Josiah's leg brace, which had been digging into his calf during the drive. She did all of this without speaking, her hands moving with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had done this 1,000 times. When she reached Bridger, the boy was whimpering in his sleep. His body was twitching. The beginning tremors of another reject shift, triggered by the stress. Sable sat down beside him and pulled him into her lap. She pressed her forehead against his hair and began to hum. Not a melody, just a low, steady vibration that matched her heartbeat. Her pheromones released gently, just enough. A soft, invisible blanket that settled over the boy's nervous system and smoothed the jagged edges. Bridger's trembling stopped. His breathing evened out. He curled into her chest like a cat finding the warmest spot beside a fire. Cassian stood at the front of the bus, watching through the windshield for movement in the trees. But he was not watching the trees. He was watching her reflection in the glass. The way she held the boy. The way her entire body seemed to soften and expand, as though she were not just holding him, but absorbing his pain into herself. The warmth of her pheromones reached even where Cassian stood, 15 feet away. It washed over him in gentle waves. His eyelids grew heavy. His shoulders, which had been locked in a knot of tension for 3 days, began to drop. His wolf, the beast inside him that never rested, that was always pacing, always watching, always ready for a fight, went quiet. For the first time in years, Cassian Voss Sterling felt something he barely recognized. Peace. He whispered it so softly that not even his own ears could catch it. 4 years ago, I was blind. Dawn broke gray and cold over the Bitterroot Mountains. Sable woke to find the bus already moving. Cassian had not slept. She could tell by the deeper lines around his eyes and the way he was gripping the thermos of cold coffee she had packed in the emergency kit. He had been driving all night while she dozed. She started to say something. "Thank you, maybe. Or you should have woken me." But the words felt wrong, too small for what he had done. So instead, she took the thermos from his hand and refilled it with the last of the water from the jug behind the driver's seat, and they drove in silence that was no longer hostile. 2 hours later, the bus had a flat tire, not a blowout, just the slow, inevitable death of rubber that was 20 years past its prime. Cassian pulled over at a wide spot in the logging road where a frozen creek cut through the trees. The children spilled out of the bus like prisoners released from a cell. They moved cautiously at first, testing the air, the way abused animals do when a cage door opens unexpectedly. Then Bridger found a pine cone and threw it at Josiah, who caught it with one hand and threw it back. And within 5 minutes, the clearing was full of the sounds that Sable lived for. Laughter, shrieking, the dull thud of snowballs against coats. Orrin stood apart from the others, his stuffed rabbit dangling from one hand. He watched the playing children with the guarded fascination of a boy who had never been allowed to be loud. Cassian was crouched beside the blown tire, working the jack. He noticed Orrin watching and stopped what he was doing. He sat back on his heels and looked at the boy, his nephew, the heir to everything he had built. 4 years old, with cigar burns on his shoulder and a flinch reflex so severe that any sudden movement made him curl into a ball. "Orrin," Cassian said softly, "do you want to help me?" The boy stared at him. His grip tightened on the rabbit. Cassian picked up the lug wrench and held it out. "You can hold this for me. It is a very important job. The bus cannot move without it." Orrin took 3 careful steps forward. He reached out with his free hand and took the wrench. It was almost as big as his arm. He held it with both hands, the rabbit now tucked under his chin, and looked up at Cassian with eyes that were still terrified, but also, for the first time, curious. "Good man," Cassian said. "Hold it steady." Sable watched from beside the creek where she was filling water bottles. She watched Cassian talk to Orrin in a low, patient voice, explaining each step of changing the tire as though the boy were his apprentice and not a traumatized 4-year-old. She watched Orrin's shoulders slowly drop from their permanent position near his ears. She watched the boy's mouth twitch in what might, with enough time and safety, eventually become a smile. Then Bridger ran over and tackled Orrin into a snowbank, and both boys went down in a heap of laughter and flailing limbs. Cassian reached out instinctively to catch Orrin but stopped himself. He let the boys wrestle. He watched Orrin laugh, a real laugh, high and breathless, and something in the Alpha King's iron composure cracked. He turned away from the children. He walked to the edge of the creek and stood with his back to everyone, his hands at his sides. His shoulders shook once, then again. He pressed the heels of his palms against his eyes and stood there, breathing, for a long time. Josiah limped over to Sable. "Is the king crying?" he asked, genuinely confused. "I think so," Sable said. "I did not think alphas could cry." "They can," Sable said. "They just usually do it where no one can see." That evening, they camped inside the bus. Cassian had built a small fire in a metal bucket outside the door to take the edge off the cold, and the warmth crept in through the open windows just enough to keep the children from shivering. Nettie distributed the last of the canned soup, heated over the bucket fire in a dented pot, and for 20 minutes the bus was filled with the simple, sacred sounds of children eating. After the kids had settled into their seats for the night, Sable sat on the steps of the bus door with a first aid kit open on her knee. Cassian sat one step below her, his back to her, his shirt pulled up. The wounds from the farmhouse fight were mostly healed, but 3 deep gashes across his ribs had closed badly. The skin puckered and angry where debris had been trapped inside. Sable cleaned them with antiseptic and a steady hand. Her fingers pressed against the warm skin of his back, feeling the ridges of scar tissue beneath the new wounds. Old scars. Dozens of them. A map of violence written across his body in white lines and raised welts. "You have been hurt before," she said. It was not a question. Many times. "These are not battle scars." Her fingers traced a line that ran parallel to his spine. It was too precise, too deliberate. Someone did this to you with a blade, on purpose. Cassian was quiet for a long time. The fire crackled in the bucket. An owl called from somewhere deep in the pines. My father, he said finally. He believed that pain was the forge that shaped an alpha. He would cut me after every training session, one cut for every mistake. He paused. I made a lot of mistakes. Sable's hand stilled on his back. She had spent 4 years hating this man, hating the cold king who signed papers without looking. But the body beneath her fingers told a different story. A story of a boy who had been carved into a weapon long before he chose to become a king. How old were you when it started? She asked. 8. The same age as Corwin. Sable closed her eyes. The world was a wheel, she thought. The same cruelties turning and turning, passed down from father to son like a poisoned inheritance. She finished cleaning the wounds in silence. When she was done, she pressed a clean bandage against the worst of the gashes and held it there. Her pheromones leaked out, unbidden, just a trace, enough to ease the sting, enough to make his muscles unknot beneath her palm. Cassian inhaled sharply. His head dropped forward. That scent, he murmured. Your scent. It is... What? He turned his head slightly. She could see the edge of his profile in the firelight, the strong line of his jaw, the way his lashes threw shadows across his cheek. It smells like pine and milk. And... He stopped. And what, Cassian? His voice dropped so low she felt it more than heard it, a vibration that traveled through his back and into her hand. Home. It smells like home, like something I have not had in a very long time. The air between them grew heavy, not with her pheromones, with something else entirely, something voluntary and dangerous and fragile. Sable became acutely aware of the warmth of his skin under her hand, the rise and fall of his breathing, the fact that she had not touched another person like this, gently, slowly, with care, since the night Theron had held her hand under the harvest moon and lied about forever. She pulled her hand away. She closed the first aid kit with a click that sounded too loud in the quiet. Sable, Cassian said. He turned on the step to face her. The firelight caught his eyes and turned the steel to bronze. 4 years ago, I made the worst mistake of my life. Which one? She asked. Signing my exile or not looking at me while you did it? The words should have been bitter. They were. But underneath the bitterness, there was something raw. An old wound she had thought was scarred over, now suddenly open and bleeding. Cassian held her gaze. Both, he said. I was a coward. I hid behind the law because the law was easier than thinking, easier than seeing. He swallowed. I see you now, Sable. I see what you built. I see what you are. And I am sorry that it took me losing everything to open my eyes. Sable looked at him for a long time. The fire popped. A child murmured in sleep somewhere behind them. Sorry does not undo Nettie's scar, she said quietly. No, it does not. And it does not give Josiah back his childhood. No. Then what good is it? Cassian reached out. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. He took her hand. His fingers were rough and warm, and they closed around hers with a gentleness that seemed impossible for a man who had just killed 5 people with a chair leg. It is a beginning, he said, if you will let it be. Sable looked down at their joined hands. His skin was dark against hers. She could feel his pulse through his fingertips, strong and steady, a rhythm that her own body instinctively wanted to match. She did not pull away. She did not lean in. She sat with it, the weight of his hand in hers, the warmth of the fire, the soft breathing of 18 children who depended on her to make the right choice. "We will see," she said. It was not forgiveness, it was not trust, but it was a door left unlocked, and for now, that was enough. The next morning, Cassian told her about Harlan. They were driving again, the replacement tire holding, the bus grinding along a logging road that cut through a valley between two snow-covered ridges. The children were awake but subdued, passing around a bag of dried apples that Josiah had found in the emergency kit. "I denied his funding requests for years," Cassian said. His voice was low enough that the children could not hear over the engine noise. He called it the Genetic Purity Project. He said he was researching ways to strengthen the bloodline, to eliminate defects before birth. I told him it was eugenics and I would not fund it. "But he did it anyway," Sable said. "I think so." Cassian's grip on the wheel tightened until the tendons in his forearms stood out like cables. "When I was fighting Gaunt at the cabin, he whispered something before he went down. He said, 'The trials are not over.' He was not talking about a legal proceeding. I think Harlan has been running experiments on children, and I think Oren is his latest subject." Sable felt the bottom of her stomach drop away. Because Oren is a late shifter. Because he is small. Because his wolf has not manifested. Because Harlan sees his own son as a failure that needs to be corrected through science. Cassian looked in the rearview mirror at the rows of children. His voice was barely a whisper. "And if he is doing this to his own son, the heir apparent, what do you think is happening to the children who have no one? The ones who disappear from the system and no one asks questions?" Sable knew exactly what happened to them. She had buried 3 of them in the woods behind her house over the past 4 years. Children who had escaped facilities she could not name and died on her doorstep before she could save them. Their bodies had carried surgical scars, needle marks, the chemical smell of sedation. "They are not just being discarded," Sable said, and her voice sounded strange, even to herself. Hollow, cold. "They are being harvested." Cassian nodded. The word hung in the air between them like something rotting. "I need to get to my brother," Cassian said. "I need to confront him. But first, I need to get these children to safety." "The Red Sands," Sable said. "There is a pack in Nevada, led by an alpha named Bracken. They operate outside council jurisdiction. They owe me a favor." Cassian frowned. "The Red Sands are mercenaries. They will sell us out for the bounty on my head." "No, they will not." Sable's voice carried a quiet certainty that made Cassian look at her. 2 years ago, Bracken's daughter went into a reject shift. The pack healers could not stop it. She was dying. Bracken sent word through the underground network, and I drove 14 hours through a blizzard to reach her. I held that girl for 6 hours until her wolf stabilized. Bracken swore a blood debt. He does not break those. Cassian looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. It was not pity. It was not gratitude. It was something closer to recognition. The look a general gives when he realizes the person standing beside him is not a civilian but a fellow soldier. "You have a network," he said. "I have what I needed to survive. You have alliances with rogue packs, a medical protocol for reject shifts, a sanctuary hidden from every tracking system in the country, and a biological weapon that can drop a squad of enforcers in 10 seconds. He shook his head slowly. "You built a kingdom, Sable, in the shadows of mine." Sable looked out the window. The mountains were turning purple in the early morning light. Snow was falling again, soft and thick, covering the road ahead in white. "It is not a kingdom," she said. "It is just a bus full of kids who need somebody to give a damn about them." But she felt the flush of warmth in her chest when he said it, and she did not entirely hate it. By mid-afternoon, the road had widened and the trees had thinned, and for the first time in 2 days, the tension inside the bus began to ease. Orrin had migrated from his seat to the floor, where he was building a tower out of empty soup cans with Bridger. Nettie was braiding Lunet's hair while Vera watched and offered unsolicited advice. Josiah was reading a water-damaged paperback he had found under one of the seats, his bad legs stretched out across the aisle. It felt almost normal, almost safe. Sable leaned her head against the cold window and closed her eyes. She let herself imagine, just for a moment, that this was real, that the danger was behind them, that they would reach the red sands and Bracken would shelter them and she could put the children to bed in a room with a locked door and know that no one was coming to burn it down. She imagined Orrin growing up without flinching, Bridger going a whole month without a reject shift, Nettie laughing without covering her scar. She imagined Cassian standing beside her, not as a king, but as a man who had finally learned to see. It was a beautiful dream. It lasted about 4 more seconds. The bus lurched violently. A sound like a cannon shot split the air. Sable's head slammed against the window. Children screamed. Cans scattered across the floor. Cassian wrestled with the wheel, fighting to keep the heavy vehicle from sliding off the icy road and into the ravine below. "Hold on," he shouted. The bus skidded sideways, gravel spraying in a wide arc, before slamming into a snowbank and grinding to a halt. "Everyone okay?" Sable shouted, unbuckling immediately and running to the back. "We are okay," Josiah yelled, pulling Nettie off the floor. "Just shaken up." Cassian kicked the driver's door open and jumped out. He checked the tire. It was not a natural blowout. There were steel spikes scattered across the road in a deliberate line, the kind of spikes used by law enforcement or by hunters. "Ambush!" Cassian roared. "Sable, get them down!" But the attack did not come from the woods behind them. A lone figure stepped out from behind a cluster of pine trees ahead of the bus. He was not wearing council armor. He was wearing a tattered leather jacket and jeans, and he held a compound bow with an arrow nocked and aimed at Cassian's heart. Sable looked through the cracked windshield. She knew that stance. She knew that jacket. She knew the way he tilted his head when he was about to say something cruel, as though cruelty were a form of charm. Theron. The man who had promised to love her regardless of her rank. The man who, the moment the council declared her defective, had stood up in front of everyone she had ever known and thrown her away like a broken tool. "Hello, Cassian," Theron called out. His voice was smooth and confident, the voice of a man who believed he was holding all the cards. "You are a long way from the throne." Cassian's claws extended. "Theron, I should have executed you for treason years ago." "You should have," Theron agreed pleasantly. He shifted his aim. The arrow swung from Cassian to the windshield, directly at Sable. "Sable, darling, you look tired." The word darling hit her like a slap. She gripped the dashboard until her knuckles whitened. "The bounty on the king is 50 million, Theron continued. "But the bounty on the Omega Witch who knocked out a squad of enforcers? That is priceless. Elder Creighton wants you alive. He wants to know how a defect can do what you do." "You are working for Creighton," Sable said through the glass. "You used to hate the council." Theron shrugged, one shoulder, casual. I like money more than principles. Always have. You just never noticed because you were too busy believing the best in people. He smiled. That smile. The one she had once found beautiful. That was always your weakness, Sable. You trust. From the woods on either side of the road, yellow eyes appeared. Dozens of them. These were not enforcers. These were rogues. Feral, starving wolves that had been hired as expendable mercenaries. They were uncoordinated and half mad with hunger, but they were numerous. Far too numerous. Cassian. Sable pressed her hand flat against the glass. Her voice was barely a whisper. There are too many. Cassian looked at the pack of rogues circling the bus. Then he looked back through the windshield at Sable, at the 18 children behind her, at his nephew, who was clutching his stuffed rabbit with both hands and shaking. He made the decision instantly, the way soldiers do. He turned to the bus window. Sable, can you drive this thing on 3 wheels? What? Cassian, no. The rim is steel. It will hold for a few miles. Get to the red sands. Bracken will protect you. I am not leaving you here. You are not leaving me. You are saving them. He looked past her at the rows of children, at Oren. His voice dropped to something barely audible, something meant for her and no one else. Take care of my nephew. Take care of all of them, the way you always have. He walked to the front of the bus and placed his hand flat against the glass. Sable pressed her hand against the other side, their palms aligned. She could feel the warmth of his skin through the cold window. So close, so impossibly far away. Cassian, she said. His name tasted like grief. He looked at her through the glass. His steel eyes were soft in a way she had never seen. Not the eyes of a king. The eyes of a man who had just discovered, far too late, what mattered. Then he turned away. He walked toward Theron and the horde of yellow eyes. He unbuttoned his shirt cuffs. He rolled his head on his neck until the vertebrae cracked. He did not look like a king anymore. He looked like something older. Something primal. Something that the darkness itself should be afraid of. He threw his head back and let out a roar that shook the snow from the trees. His body cracked and reshaped, bones snapping, muscle tearing, fur bursting from his skin in a wave of black. He shifted into a massive midnight wolf, standing nearly 5 feet tall at the shoulder. His eyes burned amber in the failing light. The alpha of alphas, the last line of defense between the monsters and the children. He charged. Sable scrambled into the driver's seat. She was sobbing. Tears blurred everything. She slammed the bus into gear and stomped on the gas. The bus groaned. The bare steel rim ground against the asphalt, sending a rooster tail of sparks into the snow. She swerved around Theron, who fired an arrow that shattered the side mirror and embedded itself in the doorframe inches from her head. She did not stop. In the rearview mirror, she saw the black wolf disappear into a sea of gray and brown bodies, teeth flashing, blood spraying. A king fighting with suicidal ferocity to buy time for a bus full of broken children and the woman he had only just begun to see. Then she turned the corner, and he was gone. Sable drove for 2 hours on the steel rim. The vibration was relentless, a grinding bone-deep tremor that traveled up through the steering column and into her arms and her shoulders and her teeth. The sound was worse, metal screaming against asphalt, a banshee wail that filled the bus and made the younger children press their hands over their ears and squeeze their eyes shut. She did not stop. She could not stop. Every time she blinked, she saw the black wolf disappearing into that sea of gray bodies, and every time she blinked, she forced her eyes open again and stared at the road ahead because the road was the only thing she could control. The mountains gave way to high desert. The snow thinned. The sky turned from gray to a washed-out lavender as the sun set somewhere behind the clouds. The bus shuddered and groaned, and the rim threw sparks that left glowing orange trails in the gathering dark. Nettie sat directly behind the driver's seat. She had not spoken since the ambush. Her hand rested on Sable's shoulder, a silent anchor. Josiah had taken command of the back of the bus with a quiet authority that made Sable's chest ache with pride. He had organized the children into buddy pairs. He had distributed the last of the water. He had wrapped his own jacket around Orrin, who was shivering in Bridger's arms. The rim finally sheared off 12 miles from the Nevada border. The bus made a sound like an animal dying. The front left corner dropped and the vehicle slewed sideways across the empty road, tearing a gash in the asphalt before grinding to a halt in the gravel shoulder next to a truck stop that looked like it had been abandoned sometime during the previous decade. A single sodium light buzzed and flickered above a row of dead gas pumps. The parking lot was empty. The windows of the attached diner were dark. Sable killed the engine. The silence rushed in like water filling a vacuum. It was so sudden and so complete that for a moment nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The bus ticked as the engine cooled. Wind pushed dust across the parking lot in small spirals. "Where is Uncle Cassian?" Orrin's voice came from the back of the bus. It was small and thin, and it cut through Sable like a razor drawn across wet paper. She rested her forehead against the steering wheel. The vinyl was cold and cracked, and it smelled like diesel and old sweat. She pressed her eyes shut and felt the hollowness in her chest expand, a black, empty space that she had not felt since the night 4 years ago when the palace doors closed behind her and the snow swallowed her whole. But this was worse. 4 years ago, she had lost her home, and her name, and her future. And she had survived because she had expected it. She had known, somewhere in the back of her mind, that the world would eventually take everything from her. She had been prepared for that kind of loss. She had not been prepared for this kind. The kind where someone chooses to stay behind so that you can keep going. The kind where the last thing you see is a hand pressed against glass and eyes that are finally seeing you, right at the moment when seeing you means saying goodbye. "He stayed behind, Orrin," Sable said, without lifting her head. Her voice was steady. She would not cry in front of the children. She would not. "Is he coming back?" Sable did not answer. She reached into her jacket pocket. Her fingers closed around the only thing Cassian had left her. His tactical phone. A heavy military-grade device in a black rubber case. He had slid it across the dashboard in the final seconds before he stepped off the bus, a gesture so quick and deliberate that she had not registered it until now. The screen was cracked but functional. She pressed the power button. One new message. Not from Cassian, from an unknown number. She read it. Then she read it again. The text was brief. It had the clipped surgical tone of a man who was accustomed to issuing commands and having them obeyed without question. "I have the king. If you want him to remain in one piece, you will bring the boy to the old iron foundry in Sector 4, alone. You have 24 hours. H.S. H.S. Harlan Sterling, Cassian's own brother." Sable stared at the screen until the words blurred. The Alpha King had sacrificed himself to save them only to be captured, not by the Council, not by Theron and his mercenaries, by his own blood, by the brother who burned his own son with cigars and called it science, by the man who was dismantling children for parts and calling it progress. And now Harlan had Cassian, and Harlan wanted Oren, and Sable had 24 hours to decide. She could run. The Red Sands were close. Bracken would take them in. She could disappear into the rogue network with the children and build another sanctuary in another forest and spend another 4 years fixing fences and burying the ones she could not save. It was the safe choice, the smart choice, the choice that kept 18 children alive. Or she could go back. She could go back for the man who had signed her exile without looking at her. The man who had driven a school bus through a blizzard. The man who had sat on a step while she cleaned his wounds and told her she smelled like home. The man who had pressed his hand against the glass and looked at her with those steel eyes gone soft and said, "Take care of all of them, the way you always have." The man who was probably being tortured right now in a rusted factory while his brother sharpened his instruments and prepared to drain the alpha power from his blood. Sable looked up from the phone. She looked in the rearview mirror. 18 faces looked back at her. Some were sleeping, some were crying. Oren was staring at her with his dark, ancient eyes, the stuffed rabbit crushed against his chest. Waiting. She looked at those faces for a long time. She memorized them the way she had memorized the face of the little girl who had grabbed her hand in the Great Hall 4 years ago. She held them in her mind like prayer beads, like promises. Then she wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist, and her expression changed. The grief did not leave. It went somewhere deeper. Somewhere behind her ribs, where it hardened into something else entirely. Something with edges, something with teeth. "Josiah," she said. The boy looked up from the back of the bus. Even in the dark, she could see the fear in his eyes. But she could also see the iron. The same iron she had put there over 4 years of teaching him that being broken did not mean being weak. "Get the maps." Josiah reached under his seat and pulled out the folded road atlas Sable kept in every vehicle she owned. He brought it forward and spread it across the dashboard. His hands were trembling, but his eyes were steady. "We are not going to the Red Sands," Sable said. Nettie's hand tightened on her shoulder. "We are not?" "No." "Then where are we going?" Sable looked at the map. She looked at the blinking cursor on Cassian's phone, marking the location of the iron foundry. She looked at the clock on the dashboard. 23 hours and 41 minutes. She started the engine. It coughed, sputtered, caught. The bus vibrated around them like a living thing refusing to die. "We are going to war," Sable said. The bus pulled out of the truck stop on 3 wheels in a prayer, heading south through the Nevada dark. Behind them, the sodium light flickered once and went out, and the desert swallowed the road whole. Bracken had sent a flatbed to meet them at the state line. They loaded the dead bus onto it like a wounded animal and rode the last 40 miles in the cab of the truck. 18 children packed together in the back seat and the cargo bed, wrapped in blankets that smelled of motor oil and desert sage. The motel on the outskirts of Reno was a graveyard of neon lights and broken dreams. It was the kind of place where the vacancy sign had been stuck on permanently because nobody ever stayed long enough to matter. The carpet in the lobby smelled of cigarette ash and regret. The walls were thin enough to hear a whisper through. The parking lot was cracked and weedy and lit by a single buzzing fluorescent tube that turned everything the color of old bruises. It was perfect. Sable had chosen it precisely because it was the kind of place where nobody looked twice at a woman checking in with 18 children and no luggage. She paid cash. She used a false name. She requested 3 adjoining rooms on the ground floor with a view of the parking lot exit. The children were asleep within minutes of hitting the mattresses. They slept the way traumatized children sleep, suddenly and completely, as though consciousness were a coat they could not wait to take off. Josiah stayed awake. He sat in a chair by the window of the 3rd room with the crowbar across his knees and his bad leg propped on the heater, watching the parking lot with the focus of a boy who had decided, somewhere in the last 48 hours, that he was no longer a child. Sable stood in the center room. She had spread a topographic map of western Nevada across the stained bedspread and was marking coordinates with a pen she had borrowed from the front desk. The iron foundry in Sector 4, the access roads, the perimeter, the ventilation system. The ventilation system was the key. She had studied it for 20 minutes, and she knew. A knock at the door, 3 slow beats. A pause, 2 fast ones. The pattern she had established with the rogue network 2 years ago. She opened the door. Bracken filled the door frame the way a boulder fills a riverbed. He was 6'5", with a shaved head crisscrossed by scars, and a beard that reached the middle of his chest. His hands were the size of dinner plates. His eyes were the flat, pale gray of a man who had done terrible things and made peace with every single one of them. He was the alpha of the Red Sands Pack, a mercenary, a killer, and a criminal in the eyes of every council in the country. He was also a father. And that was the only thing that mattered tonight. "You have a lot of nerve calling me, Holloway," Bracken grumbled, chewing on a toothpick. He leaned against the door frame and crossed his arms. "The council has a kill on sight order on you. And now I hear you have the Alpha King's nephew riding around in a school bus. You are radioactive. I have something better than nerve, Bracken." Sable reached into the canvas bag on the bed and pulled out a small glass vial. Inside was a clear, viscous liquid that caught the light like liquid mercury. She tossed it to him. Bracken caught it with one hand. He brought it to his nose and sniffed the stopper. His pale eyes went wide. For a moment, the mercenary mask cracked completely, and what was underneath was raw and desperate and terrified. "Is this what I think it is?" "Concentrated null serum," Sable said, "synthesized from my own blood. It stops the reject shift instantly. It stabilizes the genetic breakdown in mixed blood pups." She paused. Let the words land. "You have a daughter who suffers from the shakes, Bracken. The healers told you she would not live past 12. This will buy her a lifetime." Bracken stared at the vial. His enormous fist closed around it with a tenderness that was almost painful to watch. He was not a warlord right now. He was not a mercenary. He was just a man standing in a motel doorway holding a miracle in his hand and trying not to break it. "What do you want?" he asked. His voice was low and rough and stripped of every pretense. "I need soldiers. I am hitting the old iron foundry in Sector 4 tonight. I need to extract a prisoner." "Who is the prisoner?" Sable lifted her chin. "Cassian Voss Sterling, the Alpha King." Bracken choked on his toothpick. He pulled it out of his mouth and stared at her. "You want me to take my rogue pack to rescue the king, the man who hunts us, the man who put a bounty on every one of my people." "The man who saved us," Sable corrected. Her voice did not waver. "Cassian is not his brother. He did not know about the experiments. He did not know what Harlan was doing to the children. He stayed behind to fight off a horde of rogues so that my kids could escape. He bled for them, Bracken. He bled for children who were not even his. He is still a Sterling. He is the only thing standing between us and total annihilation. Sable stepped closer. The air around her shifted. Her grounder ability was manifesting, not aggressively, but with authority, a weight that pressed against the chest and demanded attention. If Harlan takes the throne, he will expand the purity laws. He will hunt down every mixed blood, every rogue, every child with a limp or a stutter or an incomplete shift, and he will burn them. All of them. If we save Cassian, we have a chance to change the laws. We have an ally on the throne. Bracken looked at her. He felt the pressure of her presence, heavier than any alpha command he had ever faced, not because it demanded submission, because it invited trust, because it said, "I am telling you the truth, and you know it." "You have changed, Sable," he murmured. "You used to be a scared little girl fixing fences." "I was never scared," Sable said. "I was just waiting." Bracken sighed. He tucked the vial into his vest pocket and straightened up. "My pack is 10 minutes out, but we do not do this for the king." He pointed a thick finger at her. "We do this for the mother." Sable blinked. "The what?" Bracken smirked. It was the first time his face had done anything resembling warmth. "That is what the underground calls you, the mother of the lost. You did not think you were anonymous, did you? Every rogue from here to Canada knows about the Omega who heals the broken." Sable felt a flush of heat climb her neck. She pushed it aside. She turned back to the map. "Josiah," she called. The boy appeared in the connecting doorway. He had heard everything. His jaw was set and his eyes were fierce, and he looked, in that moment, like a young alpha, despite his withered leg and his 16 years and the fear that he was trying so hard to hide. "You are in charge of the children while I am gone," Sable said. "Take the bus. Go to the Red Sands coordinates Bracken gives you. Do not stop for anything." "I want to come with you," Josiah said. "I can shoot." "I know you can, but I need you to be the alpha for them right now." She crossed the room and gripped his shoulder. She looked him in the eye. "You have been the bravest person on that bus since the moment we left Montana. I need you to be brave for a few more hours. Can you do that?" Josiah's lip trembled. He bit it hard enough to draw blood. "You're coming back," he said. It was not a question. He was daring the universe to make it a lie. "I am coming back." He nodded. Once. He turned and limped back to his post by the window. Nettie was standing in the hallway. She had been listening too. She crossed the room and wrapped her arms around Sable without a word. The scar on her throat pressed against Sable's collarbone. She held on for a long time. "You are the only person who never left us," Nettie whispered. Sable closed her eyes and held the girl. She breathed in the scent of her hair. Cheap motel shampoo, and something underneath that was purely Nettie. Wildflowers and courage, and the metallic trace of a wound that would never fully heal. "I will never leave you," Sable said. "That is not a promise. It is a fact." She pulled back. She looked at Bracken. "Tell your men to bring gas masks. We are not going to outfight them." "Then what are we going to do?" "We are going to suffocate them." Bracken raised an eyebrow. Sable pointed to the ventilation schematics of the foundry on the map. "Harlan thinks power is about teeth and claws. I am going to show him that the most dangerous thing in nature is not the wolf." She traced the air ducts with her finger. It is the atmosphere. The old iron foundry was a relic of another century, a sprawling complex of rusting catwalks and dead smelting pots and brick chimneys that rose into the Nevada sky like broken fingers pointing at a god who had stopped paying attention. The surrounding desert was flat and featureless, which meant no cover for an approach, which meant they came from above. Sable lay on the roof of the foundry's main building. The industrial HVAC unit squatted beside her like a sleeping mechanical beast. Its fan housing was the size of a car. The ductwork fed into every room in the complex through a network of sheet metal channels that had not been maintained in decades, but were still, critically, still functional. Below her, through the skylights, she could see the factory floor. Harlan Sterling stood on the observation deck. He was sharper than his brother, leaner. Where Cassian was rugged muscle and blunt force, Harlan was wired tension and surgical malice. He wore a lab coat over tactical gear, which struck Sable as the most honest thing about him. Half scientist, half soldier, all monster. Below the observation deck, suspended by silver chains over a cold smelting pit, was Cassian. Sable's breath caught. He was barely recognizable. Shirtless, his chest was a map of fresh lacerations and burns. His head hung forward. Blood dripped from his nose in a steady rhythm, tapping against the concrete far below like a metronome counting down the remaining minutes of his life. They had been injecting him with wolfsbane every hour. She could see the needle marks on his arms, purple and swollen. The wolfsbane was keeping him from shifting, from healing, from doing anything except hanging there and bleeding. But he was alive. His chest rose and fell in shallow, ragged increments. He was alive, and that was enough. That was everything. Harlan was talking. His voice echoed off the metal walls, distorted by the acoustics of the cavernous space into something that sounded almost inhuman. "She is not coming, you know," Harlan called down to his brother. "She is a smart girl. She took the brat and ran." Cassian lifted his head. It took visible effort. Blood ran from a split above his eyebrow and pooled in the hollow of his collarbone. "You do not know her." "I know Omegas," Harlan sneered. "Weak, subservient, cowardly. It is biology, Cassian. Just like it is biology that you were born the strongest and I was born the spare." He walked to a table covered in surgical instruments and vials of glowing green fluid. But science can change biology. He picked up a syringe filled with something that pulsed with a faint, sickly luminescence. "I have cracked the code, brother. The boy, Oren, his genetic defect is the key. His cells do not reject foreign DNA. I can splice alpha strength into any subject. I can create an army of kings. I just need his marrow. He is your son." Cassian's voice was a rasp of pure contempt. "He is a failed experiment." Harlan held the syringe up to the light. "But you, Cassian, you will be my masterpiece. I am going to strip the alpha power from your blood and inject it into myself, and then I will be the king." Sable had heard enough. She turned to the HVAC unit. Bracken's men had already removed the access panel. The fan assembly was exposed, a massive industrial turbine that could push air through every duct in the building. She had spent the last 20 minutes preparing. A rubber tube ran from a needle in her arm to a collection bag, and from the collection bag through a nebulizer that Bracken had stolen from a veterinary clinic on the way. The nebulizer was connected to the intake port of the HVAC system. Beside it sat 6 canisters of veterinary sedative, the kind used to tranquilize horses. She was not just releasing pheromones, she was industrializing them. Sable closed her eyes. She reached inside herself, past the exhaustion, past the fear, past the image of Cassian hanging like a broken marionette. She found her heartbeat. She found the place where the power lived, and she opened it wider than she ever had before. Her blood, laced with concentrated grounder pheromones, flowed through the nebulizer and was atomized into a fine, invisible mist. The HVAC fans roared to life. The mist entered the ductwork and spread through the building like a whispered command. Sleep. Surrender. Let go. On the factory floor, the first guard swayed. He was a massive man, easily 260 pounds of muscle and aggression, pumped full of combat stimulants. He blinked, his rifle dipped, his knees softened. "What?" he mumbled. "What is that?" He hit the ground face first. Then the second guard dropped, and the third, and the fifth. The white mist crept through the vents like a living thing, curling around ankles, rising to waists, filling lungs. Guns clattered to concrete. Bodies slumped against walls, against machinery, against each other. 20 hardened killers, the finest soldiers Harlan Sterling could buy, folded like paper in rain. "What is happening?" Harlan screamed from the observation deck. He pressed a rag against his mouth and nose. He was an alpha. He could resist it longer, but his vision was swimming, his balance tilting. "Gas! Put your masks on! Someone check the ventilation!" But there was no one left standing to check anything. The skylights shattered. Ropes dropped from the darkness above. Bracken and his Red Sands commandos descended wearing gas masks, moving with the brutal efficiency of men who did this for a living. They hit the factory floor in a synchronized wave, zip-tying the unconscious guards before the pheromones could wear off. In the back of the factory, behind a reinforced steel door that Bracken's men had to cut through with bolt cutters, they found them. 11 children, thin, pale, wearing identical gray hospital gowns. They blinked in the sudden light like animals emerging from underground. The youngest was maybe 5. The oldest was a girl of perhaps 10, with dark eyes and round cheeks, and a face that Sable recognized with a jolt that nearly took her off her feet. She knew that face. She had memorized it 4 years ago in the aisle of Sterling Palace, when a small girl had grabbed her hand and asked where she was going. The girl looked up at Sable. Her eyes widened. "Miss Sable," she whispered, "you came back." Sable dropped to her knees and pulled the girl into her arms. The circle that had begun 4 years ago in a great hall full of silence closed in a factory full of sleeping soldiers. She held the girl, and she wept, and she whispered, "I told you," somewhere far away. But I came back. Sable did not rappel down from the roof. She walked in through the front doors. She wore the heavy canvas coat. She carried a flare gun in her right hand. Her left arm bore the needle mark where her blood had been drawn. She was pale and drained, and her hands were shaking, and she did not care. She walked through the rows of sleeping soldiers. She walked through the mist of her own making. She walked into the center of the factory floor, and she looked up at the observation deck, and she locked eyes with Harlan Sterling. "Let him down," Sable said. Her voice was not loud, but in the acoustic chamber of the foundry, it carried like a bell struck in an empty church. Harlan staggered back from the railing. He looked at his army of sleeping men. He looked at the woman standing among them, his face twisted with something between rage and terror. "You," he snarled, "you witch." He slammed his hand onto the control panel behind him. The chains holding Cassian jerked. The pulley system engaged with a grinding screech, beginning to lower Cassian slowly toward the smelting pit. It was not filled with molten iron, but the pit was deep and dark, and lined with jagged scrap metal that would tear a body apart on impact. "Come and get him!" Harlan screamed. The sound was unhinged, cracking at the edges. He vaulted over the railing and landed on the catwalk halfway down. In midair, he shifted. The transformation was grotesque. It was not the fluid, powerful shift of a healthy wolf. It was wrong. Harlan's wolf form was hairless. The skin stretched tight over bulging muscles that had been chemically enhanced beyond their natural limits. Bone spurs protruded from his spine like the plates of some prehistoric monster. His eyes were not amber or yellow. They were green, the same sickly green as the fluid in his syringes. He had experimented on himself, and what stood on the catwalk now was not a wolf. It was an abomination. Bracken stepped forward, drawing a combat knife. "I will handle this." "No." Sable put her hand on his chest. "Get Cassian. Stop the pulley. Harlan is mine." Bracken stared at her. "Sable, he will kill you. Go." He went. He sprinted toward the control panel, his massive frame covering the ground with shocking speed. Two of his commandos followed. Sable stood her ground. The Harlan creature charged down the ramp toward her. Its claws scored deep grooves in the metal grating. Its jaws opened impossibly wide, revealing rows of teeth that had been filed to points. It screamed as it ran, a sound that was part wolf and part something else entirely, something that had been broken at the molecular level and rebuilt wrong. Sable dropped to her knees. She slammed her palms flat against the factory floor. The metal was cold and gritty and real beneath her fingers. She closed her eyes and she reached inside herself one more time. But this time, she did not reach for calm. She had realized something during the fight at the farmhouse. Her power was not just about lowering energy. It was about regulating it. She could turn the dial down. Yes, she could sedate. She could soothe. But the dial turned both ways. She thought about the boy she had buried in the snow 2 years ago. 8 years old. Surgical staples in his scalp. Dead before she could save him. She thought about his face. She thought about digging his grave with her bare hands, her fingers cracking and bleeding in the frozen earth, and the sound she had made when she laid him in the ground. A sound that was not a scream and not a sob. A sound that had no name. She thought about Nettie's throat being opened by a man who was supposed to protect her. She thought about Josiah's note pinned through his skin. She thought about babies being drowned in rivers on the spring equinox. She thought about Theron standing up in the Great Hall and saying, "I cannot bind myself to a defective Omega." She thought about Cassian signing her exile without looking at her. She thought about all of it. Every wound, every scar, every cold night alone in the cabin, listening to a child scream through a reject shift. Every grave she had dug. Every name she had memorized. Every single moment of the last 4 years when the world had told her she was nothing. And she had gotten up the next morning and proved it wrong. She gathered it all. She compressed it. She forged it into a single white-hot spike of pure psychic energy. And she pushed it outward. Not calm this time. Chaos. A concentrated wave of raw, unfiltered adrenaline slammed into Harlan's nervous system like a freight train. His heart rate, already elevated from the shift and the rage, skyrocketed. His pupils blew to the edges of his irises. His muscles locked in a full-body spasm. He crashed to the ground 3 inches from where Sable knelt. His body convulsed, his limbs jerking in random directions, foam bubbling from his jaws. His heart was beating so fast it was no longer beating. It was vibrating. His entire system was locked in a sensory overload loop, every nerve firing at maximum, every synapse screaming, and there was no off switch. Too much, Sable whispered. Sweat dripped from her nose and hit the metal floor. Her arms were shaking. Her vision was graying at the edges. It is too much, is it not? Harlan seized on the floor. His green eyes rolled. His claws scraped uselessly at the grating. He could not move. He could not think. He could not do anything except lie there and feel what it was like when your own body became your prison. Sable stood up. Her legs shook beneath her. She stepped over the twitching monster and looked up. Bracken had jammed the gears. The chains had stopped. Cassian was dangling 5 feet above the scrap pit, swaying gently, his eyes closed. But his chest was moving. He was breathing. "Lower him," Sable called. Her voice cracked on the second word. Bracken worked the manual release. The chains unspooled slowly. Cassian descended the last 5 feet and collapsed onto the concrete floor of the factory with a sound that Sable felt in her sternum. She was there before his body settled. She dropped to her knees beside him and lifted his head into her lap. His face was a ruin, swollen, cut, burned. But underneath all of it, underneath the blood and the bruises, his features were still there. The strong jaw, the straight nose, the mouth that had almost smiled at her on the steps of a school bus in the mountains. Cassian. Her hands found his face. Her pheromones released instinctively, not the weaponized version, but the original, the gentle pulse that she used to calm screaming children. Warmth flowed from her palms into his skin. "I am here. I have got you." His eyes opened. They were unfocused, clouded with pain and wolfsbane. But they found her face. They locked onto her face the way a drowning man locks onto light. "Sable." His voice was a ruin. "You came back." "I told you." She smiled through the tears that were falling freely now, dropping onto his face, mixing with his blood. "I am not lost." He reached up. His hand was shaking, the fingers bloody and swollen. He touched her cheek. His thumb traced the line of her jaw with a tenderness that had no business existing in a place like this, surrounded by unconscious soldiers and rusted machinery and the twitching body of his own brother. "I see you," he whispered. "Sable, I see you." "Look out," Bracken screamed. The warning came a fraction of a second too late. Sable spun. Harlan was moving. The overload had not killed him. It had shattered his mind. He was no longer a man. He was no longer a wolf. He was something else entirely. A rabid, broken thing, driven by the only impulse left in his destroyed brain. Kill. Kill the threat. Kill the alpha. He lunged from the floor. His trajectory was wrong, uncoordinated, the movement of a creature whose nervous system was firing at random. But he was fast. Impossibly, horrifyingly fast. He was not aiming for Sable. He was aiming for Cassian. Sable did not think. There was no time to think. There was no time to strategize or calculate or weigh the options. There was only the man lying in her lap and the monster coming for him and the space between them that she could fill with her body. She threw herself over Cassian. The impact was a sound she would remember for the rest of her life, a wet, crunching, tearing sound, like fabric and meat and something fundamental being ripped apart. Harlan's claws, those chemically enhanced, bone-spurred monstrosities, buried themselves deep in her back. She felt them enter. She felt them scrape against her ribs. She felt one of them puncture her left lung with a sensation like being stabbed with a rod of ice. The pain was extraordinary. It was so large and so complete that it looped past agony and arrived at a strange, floating clarity. She could hear everything. The drip of blood hitting concrete, Bracken shouting, the wheeze of air escaping through the hole in her chest. She could feel Cassian beneath her, his heartbeat against her stomach, his hands gripping her arms, his voice raw and breaking and repeating her name like a prayer that he was terrified would not be answered. No. The word tore out of Cassian with a force that cracked the remaining glass in the factory windows. It was not a word. It was a detonation. The sound of a man watching the only thing he had left being taken from him. Something snapped inside Cassian Voss Sterling. The wolfsbane, the chemical leash that had kept his wolf caged and his healing suppressed for hours, shattered under the weight of what he felt. Not rage, not fury. Something older and deeper and more absolute. The primal cellular imperative of a wolf watching his mate die. He knew it now. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, in the moment when her blood hit his skin, and his world narrowed to a single, unbearable point, he knew what she was to him, what she had always been, mate. He exploded upward. The shift was instantaneous, violent, a detonation of bone and muscle and black fur. The massive midnight wolf tore Harlan off of Sable with his jaws and threw the creature across the factory floor. Harlan hit the far wall hard enough to dent the steel plating. He tried to rise. He got halfway up. Cassian did not give him the chance to finish. What followed was not a fight. It was an execution. The Alpha King dismantled his brother with a cold, systematic savagery that made even Bracken, a man who had seen everything, turn away. When it was over, the thing that had been Harlan Sterling was no longer recognizable as anything that had ever been alive. Cassian shifted back to human form. He was naked, covered in blood, his own and his brother's. He ignored all of it. He crawled to Sable. She was lying on the concrete. A pool of dark blood spread beneath her in a widening circle. Her breathing was shallow, wet, rattling in her chest. Each exhale produced a fine mist of pink. Cassian gathered her into his arms. His hands were enormous and bloody and shaking so badly he could barely hold her. Sable, Sable, stay with me. Do the thing. The grounding. Heal yourself. Push. Push like you push for the children. She looked up at him. Her eyes were unfocused, the brown starting to dim. She smiled. There was blood on her teeth. I cannot, she whispered. I can only heal others, never myself. That is the joke, Cassian. That has always been the joke. No, he was weeping. The Alpha King was weeping, his tears cutting tracks through the blood on his face. No, no, no. Bracken, get a medic. Get someone. Do something. Bracken was there, but he had stopped moving. He stood 3 feet away, his gas mask pushed up on his forehead, his scarred face slack with helplessness. Cassian, that is a lung puncture. She needs a trauma surgeon. The nearest hospital is... She is not dying, Cassian roared at him. The sound shook dust from the rafters. He looked down at the woman in his arms. The woman who had saved his nephew, who had defied his laws, who had built a kingdom for the broken in the ruins of everything he had destroyed, who had walked into a fortress with nothing but her own blood and a flare gun and brought it to its knees. There was one way, one ancient, forbidden, desperate way. The soul tether. A bond so old it predated the councils and the laws and the pacts themselves. A bond that was not a mark or a ceremony, but a direct fusion of two life forces. It was rumored to kill the weak. It was rumored to destroy the unworthy. It had not been attempted in over 200 years because the price was absolute. You did not give a piece of yourself. You gave everything. You opened the door between your soul and theirs, and whatever happened on the other side was permanent and irreversible and forever. Cassian did not hesitate. He leaned down. He buried his face in the curve of her neck. He found the claiming gland, the small, ancient bundle of nerves at the junction of her throat and shoulder, and he bit. Not a mark, not a claim, a detonation. He sank his canines deep, and he opened the floodgates of his own life force, his golden alpha aura, the power that made him king, the power that let him command armies and crush stone and heal from wounds that would kill any other wolf, poured out of him and into her bloodstream like liquid fire. "I command you to stay," he whispered against her skin. His body was going gray. His hands were losing their color. His vision was tunneling. He was draining himself to fill her, and he did not care. "I am not the king without you. You are not a defect. You were never a defect. You are the strongest person I have ever known, and I need you to live. Sable, live." The factory was silent. Bracken stood frozen. His commandos had stopped moving. The unconscious guards lay in their chemical sleep. The only sounds were the hum of the ventilation fans and the soft, wet rasp of a woman's breathing getting weaker and weaker and weaker. And then it stopped. For 3 seconds, there was no sound at all. 3 seconds of absolute, crushing silence in which the world held its breath and waited. Then a sharp, gasping intake of air split the quiet like a thunderclap. Sable's back arched off the concrete. Her eyes flew open. They were not brown. They were silver. Luminous, iridescent silver, blazing with a light that had no source, the unmistakable mark of a royal mate. The wound on her back began to knit together. The torn muscle reknit. The punctured lung sealed. Steam rose from her skin as the alpha blood raced through her system and rewrote her biology at a cellular level. She collapsed back against Cassian's chest. She was gasping, terrified, alive. Her hand went to her throat. She felt the bite mark, fresh, deep, permanent. She looked up at Cassian. He was gray. His eyes were dim. He had given her so much of himself that he looked like a man who had aged 20 years in 20 seconds. "You," she said. Her voice was raw and new, as though she were learning to speak again. "You bonded with a defect." Cassian pressed his forehead against hers. His tears fell on her face. His hands held her as though she were the only solid thing left in a world that had gone liquid. "No," he said. "I bonded with my queen." 6 months later, the great hall of Stirling Palace smelled of white roses and cedar, and something new, something it had never smelled of before. Hope. The hall had been rebuilt, not redesigned, not redecorated, but fundamentally altered in ways that the old guard found deeply unsettling. The carved wooden thrones where the council elders once sat in judgment had been removed. In their place stood rows of chairs upholstered in deep blue velvet, arranged in a wide semicircle that faced the altar. The rigid hierarchy of the old seating arrangement, where your proximity to the dais announced your value to the pack, had been abolished. First come, first seated, no exceptions. Which was why the front row belonged to the children. Josiah sat in the third chair from the left. He was wearing a new suit, charcoal gray, tailored to accommodate the prosthetic leg that had been fitted for him 8 weeks ago by the best orthopedic specialist in Seattle. He kept reaching down to touch it, not because it hurt, because he still could not believe it was there. For 16 years, he had dragged his withered leg behind him like an anchor. Now he sat straight. He sat tall. He sat like a young man who had finally been given permission to take up space. Beside him, Nettie wore a dress the color of autumn leaves. It had a wide neckline that left her scar completely visible. She had chosen it specifically for this reason. She had stood in front of the mirror that morning and traced the jagged line from her ear to her collarbone with her fingertip and said to Sable, "I used to hide it because I thought it meant I was broken. Now I know it means I survived. I want everyone in that hall to see what surviving looks like." Sable had kissed her forehead and said nothing because there was nothing left to say. The girl had already said everything. Oren sat on Bridger's lap. The two boys had become inseparable in the months since the Foundry. Bridger, who had once screamed through reject shifts that nearly killed him, had not had an episode in 11 weeks. The healers attributed it to Sable's serum. Sable attributed it to the fact that Bridger finally had someone who needed him. He held Oren the way a big brother holds a little brother, with one arm draped loosely around the smaller boy's chest and his chin resting on the top of his head. Oren was clutching his stuffed rabbit in one hand and a program for the ceremony in the other. The program had his name printed on the 3rd page under the heading Crown Prince Oren Voss Sterling. He had asked Sable to read it to him 4 times that morning. Lunette and Vara sat together in matching uniforms, dark blue with silver piping. The insignia on their shoulders read Royal Reconnaissance Unit. It turned out that being born without scent, the very trait that had marked them as abominations, made them the most effective scouts in the kingdom. They could move through any territory without detection. They could infiltrate any building, cross any border, pass within inches of the most sensitive wolf nose in the world, and register as nothing more than wind. Corwin sat at the end of the row. He still did not speak, but his hands moved constantly now, fluid and precise, communicating in the sign language that Sable had taught him, and that had since been adopted as an official secondary language of the Sterling Court. He was in conversation with a young woman from the Royal Communications Office who was signing back to him with a smile on her face. He was smiling too. It was the first time most of the people in the hall had ever seen him smile. The music began, not the traditional drumbeat of a pack bonding ceremony. Something softer, a single cello playing a melody that climbed and fell and climbed again, like breath, like heartbeat, like the rhythm Sable used to hum to frighten children in the dark. The doors at the far end of the hall opened. Sable Halloway walked through them alone. She did not wear white. She wore a gown of deep midnight blue, so dark it was almost black, embroidered with silver ferns that caught the light as she moved and threw tiny constellations across the walls. The ferns were a symbol. The fern was the first plant to grow back after a forest fire, the first green thing to push through the ash and say, "I am still here." Her hair had grown out in the 6 months since the Foundry. It brushed her shoulders now, dark and simple. No braids, no ornament. The bite mark on her neck was visible above the neckline of the gown. She had not hidden it. She would never hide it. She walked down the aisle with her head high and her eyes open. She looked at every face she passed. She looked at the nobles who had sat in this same hall 4 years ago and watched in silence as she was dragged out into the snow. She looked at them, and she did not flinch. and she did not smile, and she did not look away. She simply walked. Each step was steady. Each step was earned. At the altar, Cassian waited. He looked different. The severity that had defined him for years, the clenched jaw, the iron posture, the eyes that assessed everything and trusted nothing, had softened, not weakened, softened. The way steel softens when you heat it enough to reshape it into something new. He was wearing a simple black suit with no medals, no insignia, no crown. He had removed the crown that morning and set it on the dresser and told Sable that today he was not a king. Today he was just a man standing at an altar waiting for the woman who had saved him. When Sable reached him, he took her hands. His fingers closed around hers, and she felt his pulse through his skin, the same strong, steady rhythm she had felt on the steps of a school bus in the mountains, in the firelight, through a pane of glass, on a frozen road. The high priestess spoke the traditional words. She asked for the vows. Sable did not look at the book. She did not look at the priestess. She looked at the cameras mounted on the columns of the Great Hall, the cameras that were broadcasting this ceremony to every screen in the kingdom, to every pack house and rogue camp and hidden shelter where a rejected child might be watching from the shadows, might be crouched in front of a stolen phone or a cracked television, might be holding their breath and wondering if the world would ever make room for them. She spoke to those children. "I take this man," Sable said. Her voice was clear, and it carried to every corner of the hall without effort. "But I do not take only the wolf. I do not take only the crown. I take the lost. I take the broken. I take the ones who were thrown away and told they were nothing. I take them all, and I will spend every day of my life making sure that no child in this kingdom ever runs alone again." The hall was silent, the kind of silence that is not empty, but full of held breath and burning eyes, and the weight of something changing. Cassian lifted her hand to his lips. He kissed her knuckles. Then he released her hands, and he did something that no Alpha King had done in the recorded history of the Sterling line. He knelt, one knee on the marble floor, his head bowed, before the entire kingdom, before the cameras, before the nobles and the guards and the children in the front row. The most powerful wolf in the world lowered himself before the Omega who had no wolf. "I kneel before the woman I once threw away," Cassian said. His voice was rough with emotion, but he did not try to smooth it. He let it crack. He let everyone hear it crack. "I kneel before the woman who built a kingdom from nothing, who saved my nephew, who saved my soul, who walked into hell with no claws and no fangs, and brought it to its knees with nothing but her heart." He looked up at her. His steel eyes were bright. "You are my queen. You are the mother of the lost, and I am yours." Sable reached down and took his face in her hands. She lifted him to his feet. She kissed him, and the great hall of Sterling Palace did not erupt in polite applause. It erupted in howls. The sound began in the front row. Bridger threw his head back first, a high, clear note that rang off the vaulted ceiling. Oren joined him, his small voice fierce and unafraid. Then Nettie, then Josiah. Then the twins, howling in perfect unison, two voices that had no scent but carried further than any other sound in the room. The howl spread. It reached the royal guard, who dropped their formal composure and joined. It reached the nobles in the back rows, the stiff-necked men and women who had spent their lives measuring value by bloodline and rank, and one by one, they tilted their heads back and added their voices to the chorus. It was the sound of a kingdom being reborn, not through war, not through power, through the simple, radical act of deciding that no one was disposable. In the weeks that followed, Sable stood before the newly formed council and read the declaration that abolished the genetic purity laws. Every facility connected to Harlan's experiments was raided and shut down. Every child found within those facilities was brought to the sanctuary in Montana, which was no longer a sanctuary. It was the Royal Academy for Gifted Shifters. The fences that Sable had once repaired alone were now reinforced by a construction crew paid for by the Crown. The cabin had been expanded into a campus. The leaning barn had been replaced by a gymnasium. Josiah ran the morning training sessions. He stood at the front of the class, his prosthetic leg planted firm, his voice steady, teaching young wolves with damaged shifts how to find their center. He taught them the way Sable had taught him, with patience, with honesty, with the unshakable belief that being different was not the same as being less. Nettie taught the self-defense classes. She was fierce and precise, and she had a rule that she repeated at the start of every session. You are not learning to fight because you are weak. You are learning to fight because you are worth protecting. Lune and Vara led the reconnaissance unit. They moved like ghosts through the forests and the border territories, mapping safe routes for rogue children trying to reach the academy. They were invisible, and they were everywhere, and they were exactly what the broken world needed. Corwin worked in the communications office. He never spoke a word, but his hands never stopped moving, and the messages he sent, in sign and in code, and in the silent language of someone who understood what it meant to be voiceless, reached further than any speech. Theron was found by a bounty hunter 3 months after the wedding. He was stripped of his rank, his name, his pack affiliation, everything he had valued, every social currency he had traded Sable's heart to protect, was taken from him in a public hearing that lasted 11 minutes. He was cast out as a rogue. The last anyone heard, he was working as a dishwasher in a truck stop diner in Wyoming, scrubbing grease from plates with the same hands that had once slid a ring onto a woman's finger and promised her forever. Galt was imprisoned. His trial lasted 3 days. He did not speak in his own defense. Elder Creighton was not found. His mansion was empty when the Royal Guard arrived. His files were burned. His accounts were drained. He had vanished into the network of old money and older loyalties that existed beneath the surface of the kingdom like roots beneath a forest floor. The investigation was ongoing. The search was active. The noose was tightening. But he was still out there. Every month, without exception, the king and queen flew to Montana. They did not come to inspect the facilities. They did not come to review the training programs or audit the budget or make speeches. They came to sit on the floor of the common room and read stories. On a Tuesday evening in June, 6 months and 12 days after the wedding, Sable sat cross-legged on the braided rug in front of the fireplace. 14 children were arranged around her in a loose semicircle. Bridger was lying on his stomach with his chin on his fists. Orrin was curled against Sable's side, his head on her hip, the stuffed rabbit tucked under his arm. His eyes were half closed. The burn scar on his shoulder had faded to a thin white line that was barely visible beneath the collar of his pajamas. Cassian sat against the wall nearby. His long legs were stretched out in front of him. His sleeves were rolled up. Orrin's feet were resting in his lap because the boy had started the evening sitting with his uncle and had gradually migrated to Sable without either of them noticing. Cassian did not mind. He watched Sable read with an expression that had no name in any language, an expression that contained gratitude and grief and wonder and the quiet, devastating joy of a man who had been given something he did not deserve and knew it. Outside, snow was falling. The Montana sky was heavy and gray, and the flakes came down thick and slow, covering the new fences and the new buildings and the paths between them in white. Inside, the fire crackled. The children breathed. The story continued. Sable turned the page. She did not look up. She did not need to. She could feel every child in the room the way she had always felt them. Their heartbeats, their breathing, the small, sacred weight of their trust. She read the last line of the chapter and closed the book. The children groaned in protest. She smiled and told them there would be more tomorrow, and they groaned again, and she kissed the tops of their heads one by one as they filed off to their rooms. And when the last child had gone, she sat alone by the fire, with Cassian's arm around her shoulders and the snow falling outside, and the silence that was not empty, but full. "They said I would die in the snow," Sable murmured. Cassian pulled her closer. His lips brushed her temple. "They were wrong. They were wrong about everything." She looked at the fire. She looked at the room where 23 children were falling asleep in warm beds behind locked doors that no one would ever break down. She looked at the man beside her, the man who had once signed her exile without looking at her, and who now could not stop looking at her, who looked at her as though she were the answer to a question he had spent his entire life asking. "You are not defined by who rejects you," Sable said softly. "You are defined by who runs to you when the snow starts to fall." The fire burned low. The snow kept falling. And somewhere in the mountains, a child who had been running for a very long time saw a light in the distance and turned toward it. 3 days later, Cassian set a folder on the kitchen table. Sable opened it. Inside was a list. 200 names. 200 children still missing. Still trapped in facilities that had not yet been found. Still waiting in the dark for someone to come. She looked at the list for a long time. Her silver eyes caught the morning light and held it. "We are not done," she said. Cassian poured her coffee. He sat down across from her. He did not argue. He did not hesitate. He simply nodded. "No," he said. "We are not." Sable picked up a pen. She circled the first name on the list, and she began to plan.